Imagine a nomadic shepherd crossing the scorching desert of the Arabian Peninsula some 8,000 years ago. He is not looking to invent anything. He is not running an experiment or understanding the chemistry of milk. He just needs to transport a drink during an endless journey under the sun. So he pours fresh milk into a bag made from the stomach of a young animal. He ties it to the side of a donkey and continues on his way. Hours later, when he stops to drink, he discovers that the milk has disappeared. At the bottom of the bag, there is a soft, white mass surrounded by a yellowish liquid. At first glance, it seems that everything has spoiled. However, upon tasting that substance, he realizes that it is not only edible, it also has a pleasant taste, is easier to transport, and takes much longer to spoil. Without knowing it, the traveler has just produced a primitive form of cheese. We cannot claim that there was a single inventor or that the scene happened exactly like that. Similar accidents were probably repeated many times among herding communities in different regions. But the explanation is completely plausible. The desert heat, the constant movement of the journey, and the natural enzymes present in the animal's stomach could transform the milk without anyone having planned it. Around 6. The first communities of the Fertile Crescent were already domesticating goats, sheep, and later cattle. Those herds did not look like a modern dairy farm. Families moved following the seasons and used practically everything each animal offered. The skin was used to make shelters, the bones became tools, and the stomachs could be used as containers. That is precisely where the key lay. The stomach lining of a young ruminant contains rennet, a set of enzymes capable of coagulating milk proteins. When fresh milk remains inside that bag and heats up, it begins to separate into two parts. On the one hand, the whey, the liquid fraction, appears. On the other, solid lumps of curd are formed. If that curd is drained, pressed, and salted, we get the oldest and simplest version of cheese. What is extraordinary is that this accidental discovery solved several problems at the same time. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in hot climates. Cheese, on the other hand, could last much longer, withstand long journeys, and concentrate fat, protein, and energy in a compact food. For a family that had to survive difficult months, that was not a simple change in flavor. It was a preservation technology. It could also have played an important role in the relationship between human beings and dairy products. Many adults in early herding populations could not properly digest the lactose in fresh milk. During cheesemaking, a large part of that sugar is lost, along with the whey, while the proteins and fats remain in the curd. That made it possible to take advantage of the nutrients in milk with less digestive discomfort. Long before certain populations developed a greater genetic capacity to digest lactose during adulthood. In other words, cheese could have been the bridge between a new food source and bodies that were not yet adapted to drink raw milk. First came the cultural solution. Then, over many generations, biological adaptations appeared in some human groups. Archaeology shows that cheesemaking stopped being an accident and became an intentional practice in pottery fragments from around 5 plakans. Found in the territory of present-day Poland. Residues related to dairy processing have been identified. In addition, clay vessels pierced with small holes designed to separate the curd from the whey appear. Those objects reveal a decisive change. Humanity was no longer just discovering coagulated milk by chance. It had understood the process, built specific tools, and was repeating it deliberately. An everyday mistake was beginning to transform into transmitted knowledge, into essential food, and eventually into a tradition capable of surviving entire civilizations. Furthermore, it offered mobile communities a valuable reserve to trade, Share. Pastoral. Reducing the dependence on consuming milk immediately after milking, when the first great civilizations began to rise in Mesopotamia. Cheese was no longer an occasional discovery. It had become a daily food integrated into the economy and the organization of cities. Sumerian tablets, written in cuneiform around 3500 BCE, mention cheese and butter as common products. They were not exclusive delicacies of kings or privileges reserved for temples. They were part of the diet of farmers, soldiers, and workers. The administrative records of the city of Ur show rations that included cheese for those participating in the construction of some of humanity's first great monuments, while those workers erected buildings that symbolized the birth of urban life. Cheese provided them with energy, fat, and protein. In a sense, a food born of necessity was helping to physically sustain civilization. The Sumerians recorded with enormous care everything they produced, stored, and distributed. Thanks to those notes, we know that cheese was not considered a single product. They already distinguished between fresh and aged varieties, between soft curds intended for immediate consumption and firmer cheeses that could be kept for weeks or months. Some temples followed their own methods, and cities like Lagash kept detailed inventories of their reserves. Cheese was no longer simply food. It had become part of the economic infrastructure in ancient Egypt. It also acquired a symbolic dimension. Funerary paintings from the Old Kingdom show milk poured into containers and processed in ways that seem related to making soft cheeses. Much later, when excavating the tomb of Tams, a high-ranking official from the 11th century BCE, archaeologists found a solidified white mass inside a jar. Analyses indicated that it was a very old cheese, probably made with a combination of cows' and sheep's or goat's milk. That food had been sealed in a tomb for more than 3,000 years. It had not been placed there as mere leftovers, but as an offering intended to accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. For the Egyptians, therefore, dairy products could feed both the living and those entering eternity. In Greece, cheese crossed another frontier. It went from food to mythology. In Homer's Odyssey, the Cyclops, Polyphemus, appears, making it inside his cave, surrounded by baskets full of curd and shelves where the wheels slowly mature. The description is so concrete that it allows us to recognize an artisanal process very similar to the one still used by many shepherds. The Greeks attributed the knowledge of cheesemaking to Aristaeus, a deity also linked to beekeeping and rural life. Athletes consumed it before competing because they believed it strengthened the body, while soldiers carried it during their campaigns across the Aegean. In Crete and the Peloponnese, shepherds milked sheep and goats, pressed the curd into molds, and stored the cheese in clay jars, sometimes protected with olive oil. The island of Delos, one of the great commercial centers of the Aegean, received varieties from different Greek regions and distributed them to distant markets. Thus, cheese simultaneously became a ration, a commodity, an offering, and a divine symbol. It was no longer used solely to preserve milk. It expressed the identity, beliefs, and daily life of entire societies. And then came Rome. If the Greeks had treated cheese as an almost sacred tradition, the Romans also saw it as an economic opportunity. They did not invent it, but they did something decisive for its expansion. They organized its production, standardized methods, and distributed it throughout an empire that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the cold, foggy coasts of Britannia. Roman cheesemaking was documented with an extraordinary level of detail. In the 1st century, the agricultural writer Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella described the process in his work De Re Rustica, one of the great agricultural manuals of Western antiquity. He explained how to coagulate milk with rennet, separate and press the curd, add salt to preserve it, and let the wheels age in cool, dry spaces. He also paid attention to time, temperature, and technique. His instructions would seem surprisingly familiar to many artisanal cheesemakers today, even though they were written almost 2,000 years ago. Cheese was also a logistical tool. Legionaries marching through Gaul, Iberia, or Germania carried hard, aged wheels in their provisions because they could be kept for months without easily spoiling. The same empire that built aqueducts, perfected the use of concrete, and connected its territories through an immense network of roads, fed part of its expansion with a product born from coagulated milk. Wherever the legions advanced, Roman dietary customs traveled too. Local populations learned certain techniques, adapted them to the type of milk available, the climate, and their own habits, and ended up creating regional varieties. In this way, Rome not only transported cheese, it spread a way of producing it that could be transformed in each territory. Its trade networks also made it one of the first prestige foods recognized by its place of origin. Pliny the Elder compared cheeses from different regions of the empire, almost like a modern food critic would. He mentioned smoked products, intensely flavored Gallic varieties, and Alpine cheeses, especially prized in Rome. Wealthy families offered imported wheels during banquets to show refinement, while the humble population consumed locally made fresh cheese. It was at the same time a daily necessity and a luxury, and the Roman state could earn revenue from both markets. That duality reveals the extent to which cheese had penetrated society. It could appear in a soldier's backpack, on a worker's table, or among the select products of an aristocratic banquet. But in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire disintegrated. Cities lost population. Many trade routes stopped working, and roads began to deteriorate. It might seem logical that organized cheesemaking would disappear along with those structures. However, the opposite happened. Cheese survived, and much of its European continuity was linked to communities that valued discipline, repetition, and patience. The monasteries. After the fall of Rome, numerous Christian monasteries became centers of agriculture, text preservation, and knowledge transmission. Monks managed lands, kept herds, and perfected activities ranging from growing cereals to brewing beer. Cheese fit perfectly into that organized life because it required daily observation, cleanliness, perseverance, and, above all, time. Furthermore, it allowed the seasonal production of milk to be converted into long-lasting reserves, useful for feeding the community, hosting travelers, and overcoming periods of scarcity without wasting a valuable resource. Benedictine and Cistercian communities acquired a special reputation in this craft. They experimented with aging periods and observed how temperature or humidity modified the texture, aroma, and flavor. They learned to wash the rinds with brine or alcoholic beverages, encouraging the development of certain microorganisms on the surface. That practice generated more intense aromas and completely new profiles. Although no one could yet scientifically explain what was happening, they also took advantage of natural caves or excavated storage spaces in hillsides and rock walls. Underground, the environment remained cool and humid for most of the year, allowing the wheels to mature slowly and more consistently. The landscape thus became an active part of the process. The milk provided the raw material, but the temperature, humidity, and microorganisms of the environment ended up defining the character of the product. Some of the traditions associated with these monastic experiments are still represented today by famous cheeses. Roquefort is linked to the caves of southern France, where the mold that penetrated the sheep's cheese produced blue veins and a pungent flavor. Instead of considering that growth an inevitable loss, producers learned to take advantage of it and reproduce the conditions that favored it. In the Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, monastic communities contributed during the Middle Ages to the development of large, hard cheeses capable of being preserved and traveling. A tradition from which Parmigiano Reggiano would emerge. Other European areas built their own identities around products like Dutch Gouda or Alpine Gruyere. Each variety reflected a particular combination of milk, pastures, climate, locale technique, and accumulated experience. Without yet knowing microbiology, the monks understood through practice that mold and bacteria were not simple stains on the surface. During aging, those microorganisms transformed proteins and fats into smaller compounds, generating increasingly complex flavors and aromas. That is why a fresh mozzarella and a Parmigiano aged for years can seem like completely different foods. Even when both originally come from cow's milk, time did part of the work. But human observation allowed it to be repeated. Monasteries recorded results, corrected errors, and transmitted procedures from one generation to another. Thus, the knowledge ceased to depend solely on the memory of a family and could be preserved within stable communities for centuries. Cheese even ended up acquiring monetary value. In different regions of medieval Europe, some peasants paid rent or taxes using wheels of cheese instead of coins. Monasteries stored large reserves, and specialized markets emerged in cities in France, England, and the Netherlands. In certain mountainous communities in Switzerland and Italy, a family's wealth could be measured by the number of wheels aging in their cellar. In this way, cheese went through the fall of an empire and became food, technical knowledge, marchandise, and heritage. Rome had spread its methods across Europe. Monasteries protected them, refined them, and demonstrated that controlling time could transform a perishable product into something capable of retaining value for months or even years. Pay attention to this moment, because here begins the transformation of cheese into a truly global food. The age of discovery changed its history forever. When European ships began crossing the Atlantic at the end of the 15th century, they didn't just carry gold seekers, soldiers, and missionaries. They also carried livestock. And wherever cows arrived, milk appeared. Where there was milk, sooner or later, cheese emerged. Spanish colonizers introduced dairy cattle to the Caribbean and Central America in the early 16th century. The English, who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 1620s, crossed the ocean with herds and cheesemaking techniques inherited from their families. The Dutch brought their Gouda and Edam traditions to New Amsterdam, the future New York. Further north, the French brought methods for making soft cheeses inspired by Normandy and Brittany to Quebec. Cheese was almost perfect to accompany colonial expansion. It could be kept for months without refrigeration, concentrated proteins and energy in a small space, and was produced wherever there was milk, salt, and basic utensils. This made it a practical reserve for isolated settlements, but also an essential food during oceanic voyages that could last for weeks or months. When fresh food ran out, crews relied on hardy provisions. The records of the 18th and 19th centuries mention cheese alongside hardtack, salted meat, and dried legumes. The firmer and drier it was, the better it withstood the journey. Wheels of aged Edam, protected with a layer of wax to reduce moisture and mold growth, were especially useful on Dutch merchant ships sailing the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Some could remain edible after half a year at sea, and upon reaching port, they still served as barter goods. Yes, the food that had sustained Roman legionaries began to feed sailors crossing oceans. The setting had changed. but the function was almost the same: to preserve nutrients, facilitate transport, and keep people moving when there was no reliable access to fresh food. During the 17th century, cheesemaking became an important domestic activity in the North American colonies. Almost all farms produced some variety, and little by little, regional styles, defined by livestock breeds, climate, and family customs appeared. Cheddar, originally from the English town of Cheddar in Somerset, became dominant in New England and the Mid-Atlantic territories. In Vermont, families aged pungent cheeses in cold cellars during the winter. In New York, communities with Dutch influence preferred milder varieties. However, production was still limited. A family made barely a few dozen wheels per season. Distribution was local, and quality could vary wildly from one farm to another. Cheese was not yet an industrial product. It was made by hand in kitchens, barns, and small dairies, using knowledge passed down through generations. Its journey around the world had begun, but it still retained the intimate, artisanal rhythm of the communities that produced it. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had already transformed textile production, metallurgy, and transportation. Cheese, made for centuries in kitchens, barns, and small family workshops, was about to undergo the same change. Artisanal production would not disappear, but it would have to coexist with a system designed to manufacture large quantities of a uniform product. In 1851, Jesse Williams, a dairy farmer from Oneida County in New York, proposed a revolutionary idea to his neighbors. Instead of each family making their own cheese, they could bring the milk to his farm. There, Williams would process it in a facility built specifically for that purpose and apply a standardized method. The modern cheese factory was born by gathering the milk from numerous farms under one roof. The stages of production could be better controlled, differences between batches reduced, and a more predictable quality obtained. In less than a decade, hundreds of factories began operating in New York, Wisconsin, and Ohio. The milk from dozens and even hundreds of farms arrived at facilities where it was turned into cheese using uniform techniques. The railroad amplified that transformation. A food that was previously sold near where it was produced could now travel enormous distances. Cheese stopped being just a local commodity and began to become an industrial product distributed on a national scale. Shortly after, another decisive advance appeared. During the 1860s, the French chemist Louis Pasteur demonstrated that heating certain liquids to a controlled temperature allowed harmful microorganisms to be reduced without destroying the product. Although pasteurization was initially developed to protect wine, the dairy industry soon adopted the principle: pasteurized milk was safer, kept better, and offered more consistent results for the factories. That meant processing much larger volumes with less risk of contamination. However, that safety paved the way for a later debate. By controlling microorganisms, the industry gained predictability, but it could lose some of the diversity inherent in traditional cheeses. The model spread to England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Australia. At the beginning of the 20th century, cheese already had supply chains, specialized machinery, and brands competing for the market. In 1860, much of the American cheese still came from family farms. Around 1,900, factory production dominated the sector. Wisconsin played a fundamental role. Its cold climate, grazing lands, and the arrival of German and Scandinavian immigrants with dairy experience helped turn the state into the great cheese center of the United States. The nickname, America's Dairyland, reflected an economic reality. Wisconsin came to produce quantities comparable to those of entire countries. Then, James Kraft changed the rules again in 1916. This Canadian-born entrepreneur based in Chicago patented a method for heating cheese with emulsifying salts. The result was a smooth, homogeneous, and stable product, easy to cut, wrap, store, and transport. He did not aim to match the complexity of a Roquefort or a Parmigiano Reggiano. His biggest draw was convenience. During World War I, the US Army purchased more than 6 million pounds of Kraft processed cheese to feed the troops in Europe. It could be shipped in cans, withstood long journeys, and did not require the same storage conditions as many traditional cheeses. After the war, Kraft brought it to supermarkets across the country. In the 1950s, the individual slices known as Kraft singles had become a staple in American kitchens. Like it or not, they symbolized a new era. Cheese had moved from the cave, the monastery, and the farm to the assembly line and the supermarket shelf. For a time, it seemed that industrialization had solved all the problems. Cheese was cheap, uniform, and available to almost any family. Supermarkets offered dozens of perfectly wrapped options. While the small producers who had defined the trade for generations were disappearing from the landscape, the product had been democratized. But that victory came at a price. In the 1970s and 1980s, a backlash began to grow. Cooks, food writers, and consumers started asking an uncomfortable question. Why did so many cheeses taste like practically nothing? Mass production had reduced costs and improved safety, but it had also eliminated some of the personality that distinguished traditional varieties. Pasteurization controlled dangerous microorganisms, though it could also reduce the presence of natural microbes related to complex flavors. Standardization guaranteed that every package was similar to the last, but that consistency could turn a food tied to a territory into a product without an identity. In France, this conflict had been developing for decades. In 1925, Roquefort obtained one of the first legal protections designed to preserve its name, origin, and production methods. Over time, similar systems protected hundreds of European cheeses, including English Stilton, Spanish Manchego, and Greek Feta. These designations did not merely serve as commercial tools, they defended techniques passed down for centuries, specific farming landscapes, and communities whose economy depended on maintaining a particular way of producing. Then something happened that many Europeans did not expect. The United States, associated in much of the world with processed slices, melted cheese, and aerosol products, began to make artisanal cheeses capable of competing with the best on the planet. In Vermont, small dairies brought back the extended aging of cheddar. In California, new producers worked with goats and sheep's milk, drawing inspiration from French and Italian traditions without simply copying them. In Wisconsin, another generation combined European knowledge with local experimentation to create their own styles. The goal was no longer to make millions of identical pieces, but to restore cheese's relationship with milk, climate, pasture, and the artisan's decisions. What began as a small movement grew rapidly. From just a handful of producers during the 1980s, the United States went on to have more than 1,000 artisanal cheesemakers in the 2000s. Small businesses from Oregon, Wisconsin, and Virginia began to succeed in international competitions, even against competitors from countries with centuries of experience. In 2019, Rogue River Blue, a blue cheese from southern Oregon wrapped in Syrah grape leaves soaked in pear brandy, won the top honor at the World Cheese Awards. It was the first American cheese to achieve that award. The result had enormous symbolic value. The country that had taken industrialization the furthest was proving that it could also lead its artisanal renaissance. Specialty shops multiplied. Farmers' markets incorporated, wheels produced and aged in the same region, and words previously reserved for experts began entering the everyday vocabulary. Cheese stopped being seen as a simple supermarket category and returned to being presented as a work in progress, whose flavor could change depending on the season, the cattle's diet, or the place where it had aged. But the transformation was not limited to the United States. In Japan, where cheese did not historically occupy a central place in the diet, consumption increased significantly between the 1990s and the 2020s. Driven by international cuisine, fusion recipes, and a growing curiosity, India consolidated a massive dairy culture around paneer, a fresh cheese essential in many vegetarian dishes. Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico developed their own cheesemaking identities, blending European techniques with local ingredients, climates, and preferences. International competitions helped connect these traditions. The World Championship Cheese Contest, held every 2 years in Wisconsin, receives products from over 30 countries and evaluates thousands of cheeses in more than 100 categories. In Europe, the World Cheese Awards likewise bring together producers from dozens of nations. A medal can transform the reputation and sales of a small dairy almost immediately. A new culture of specialists even emerged around cheese. Master cheesemakers, affineurs dedicated to monitoring the aging process, and mongers capable of designing a selection with the same care a sommelier uses to prepare a wine list. After centuries of expansion, industrialization, and uniformity, the world rediscovered an ancient idea. A cheese is not merely preserved milk. It can also be the edible expression of a place, a community, and a way of understanding time. Today, the global industry produces more than 22 million metric tons of cheese every year. The United States, Germany, France, and Italy are among the top producers. While the European Union annually exports cheese products worth billions, mozzarella holds a dominant position, largely driven by a global pizza industry that consumes immense quantities every day. Cheddar also maintains an extraordinary presence, accompanied by countless regional specialties whose popularity varies from country to country. However, the numbers do not tell the whole story. In the hills of central France, there are still caves where wheels of Comté and Beaufort age in cool darkness, following principles that medieval producers learned to master centuries ago. In Emilia-Romagna, some financial institutions accept wheels of Parmigiano Reggiano as collateral for certain loans. The wheels remain in climate-controlled warehouses while they age, increase in quality, and acquire value, almost as if they were edible works of art. In Sardinia, some shepherds continue to make pecorino with milk from sheep that feed on local herbs and pastures. Their movements, utensils, and decisions preserve the imprint of knowledge passed down for generations. At the same time, a factory in Wisconsin can produce tens of thousands of pounds of cheese in a single day using computerized systems that monitor humidity, temperature, and bacterial cultures. These two realities seem opposed, but they are part of the same story. A shepherd working on a mountain and an industrial line taking up a massive building. A wheel tended by hand for months and thousands of identical blocks moving down a conveyor belt. Both models transform milk, and both feed the world. Cheese has proven that it can simultaneously inhabit the past and the present. That is why the most interesting question is not how it was invented. That part probably started with one or many accidents. The real question is, why did it manage to endure? Because this food survived the empires that adopted it. The disappearance of the civilizations that spread its techniques, and all the technological revolutions that tried to replace slow production with faster, cheaper alternatives. Part of the answer is practical. Milk spoils quickly. For thousands of years, before refrigerators, pasteurization, and cold supply chains, turning it into cheese was one of the most effective ways to preserve its fats, proteins, and calories for a longer time. Before becoming a gastronomic tradition, cheese was a survival technology. It helped families get through winters and periods of scarcity. It allowed soldiers to carry food when supply lines were unstable. It gave herding communities a way to store the value of their flocks in a form that could be saved, sold, traded, given as tribute, and consumed months later. A wheel of cheese when, in a sense, milk converted into time. But when the need to preserve milk was no longer so urgent, cheese did not disappear. Refrigeration allowed fresh products to be consumed year-round, and trade networks brought foods from other regions in any season. Even so, people continued to choose it because it was no longer just a solution against spoilage. It had become a pleasure. There is the sharp hit of an aged cheddar, the creamy texture of a perfectly ripe brie, the salty tang of crumbled feta, and the strings of mozzarella stretching over a pizza fresh out of the oven. None of those experiences respond to a food emergency anymore. We seek them out because they awaken memories, accompany celebrations, and turn an ordinary meal into something special. Billions of people consume cheese, not because it is their only option, but because they enjoy doing so. The other part of the answer is cultural. Cheese possesses an almost limitless ability to adapt. Every society that received it ended up modifying it. France turned it into a universe of varieties tied to specific towns, caves, and landscapes. Italy integrated it into the structure of one of the most influential cuisines in the world. Switzerland built a recognizable part of its identity around it. The United States industrialized it on an unprecedented scale and later drove a new generation of artisanal producers. Japan incorporated it into its contemporary gastronomy. According to its own tastes, cheese demands no loyalty to a single recipe. It changes with the available milk, the animals, the pastures, the humidity, the microorganisms, and human customs. It absorbs the character of the place where it is produced. That flexibility explains why it can present itself as peasant food, a luxury item, an everyday ingredient, a national symbole, or a haute cuisine creation without ceasing to be recognizable. That is the true legacy of that supposed nomadic accident. A bag made from the stomach of an animal, some milk, heat, and movement gave rise to a solution that spanned the birth of Mesopotamia, Greek mythology, the expansion of Rome, medieval fragmentation, transoceanic voyages, colonization, the Industrial Revolution, and the global economy. Cheese did not merely withstand those transformations. At each stage, it found a new function and a new way to thrive. Right now, in some cave in southern France, a wheel of Roquefort is slowly developing its blue veins. In Vermont, an artisan transforms this morning's milk into curd. In Tokyo, someone tastes a European-style cheese for the first time and discovers an unexpected flavor somewhere else. A factory produces the mozzarella that will end up tonight on a delivered pizza. Scenarios separated by continents, technology, and centuries, but connected by the same elemental process. Everything leads to a simple observation. Some of humanity's most powerful inventions did not begin with a grand plan. They began when someone paid attention to an accident and realized that what seemed spoiled could turn into something valuable. If this story changed the way you look at such an everyday food, Subscribe to The Origin of Everything. Tell us in the comments which cheese deserves to star in its own documentary, and share this video with someone who enjoys discovering the hidden stories behind what we eat. Here we will continue exploring the accidents, ideas, and discoveries that transform the world.